I'm going to go this way.
I heard all my questions in there.
Okie dokie. So, everything's starting. So, anyone else that we need to add up there? We got the Gilmores, Skip McCurry, quarantining for COVID, and the Harps, Richard and Mary. They're coming back from Arkansas. Our new evangelical minister, Jeff Howell, pray for him and everything. His travels over and the work that he's going to be doing.
Sorry, I just want to go about this. Can we put my dad back up here?
Yes.
Because he has follow-ups for his heart this month. So we're going to be able to see, if his heart's back in rhythm or if it's not, what he's going to have done.
What's his name, Marley?
Jeff?
Yeah.
Glenn?
Glenn?
Yep.
With two in?
Yep.
10 seconds to spare. You got nothing to worry about.
Yes. We were about to cancel it.
We were going to cancel it if we didn't show up.
We're early, aren't we?
A little bit. Heart test, you said?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's close enough.
Yeah, it's close.
I mean, it's his heart, so.
That's true.
Or some type of test.
Anything else? Any additions? I'm not skipping McCurry if people are watching. He was supposed to teach today, so if it's not a good lesson, blame him. But a little nervous last minute coming together. But we're in Romans 3. Let me see. Can I get Ryan? Can I get you to start us off in prayer?
God, thank you for this day that you've given us. Thank you for this opportunity that we have to come together and worship you and study more about your word. Please be with those who are sick and those who are under quarantine and those who are traveling and those who have upcoming procedures and tests. Help those to all be successful and for everyone to regain their health. And be with us in this class and help us to learn more about you, forgive us our sins, and peace.
Yeah. So, kind of just like a quick recap of what we've gone over. So, for those who are in here, what was the first chapter about, and what was the second chapter about in Romans 1? Or in Romans? What's first Romans and second, the first two chapters about?
We've been learning about how the Gentiles are part of the law and how to incorporate them in.
Yes. So, again, what happened is this Romans is written around 57 AD. And so this is right before Paul goes to the congregation in Jerusalem, and then the whole situation where he gets in prison, the ending of Acts where he goes off to Rome for his judgment. This is basically kind of an idea of what he was preaching that got the Jewish converts angry because it concerns the Gentiles. First chapter, as we looked over, he was talking about the patriarchal system, and he was saying, look, God, he gave you revelation. Y'all did what y'all did with it. He gave you the free choice, and we saw it happen. And then he presented the Mosaic Law through the patriarchy for the Jewish people, and that's what the second chapter is about. Second chapter was talking about how the Jewish people, they too are no different. They were given the Mosaic Law, a perfect law, and they fell short. And so what we're going to see in chapter 3 is kind of a reconciliation or a joint view that both the Jews and the Gentiles are no different. And so, can someone get the first 8 verses? Let's get the first 8 verses. Someone can read that for us.
What advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. For what if some did not believe, will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man is a liar, as it is written, that ye may be justified in your words, and may be overcome when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man. Certainly not, for then how will God judge the world? For the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory. Why am I also still judged as a sinner? And why not say, let us do evil, that good may come, as we are slanderously reported, as some affirm that we say their condemnation is just.
Okay, so this is a very powerful section that's going to lead us off going into Romans. So when you remember, Romans is about obedient faith. That's one of its main premises. This is like its main purposes to teach about the obedient faith, and it's supposed to help reconcile. I like for us to look at what he says. I believe it's at chapter 4 that Jack read. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? This is the Jewish people. They're saying that, basically. And this is kind of what leads, when we look at Acts, I believe it's either 20 or 21, between that section, that leads to the Jewish people to be angry with Paul for what he's teaching. Think about it. He's saying for our unrighteousness. One of the things that comes to mind, I think of, is the Sadducees right here. Their unrighteous teachings. They were a sect of Jewish people who didn't even believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in the majority of the law, in a sense. The laws they were supposed to keep. And they are saying here that if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, we're good. And another thing I want us to think about too is, this kind of goes also to the fact of how God used certain people in the Old Testament. One of the first people, I think, is the Pharaoh, when he was establishing and setting up the Mosaic Law. God used the Pharaoh in an unjust way. Did he not? He hardened the Pharaoh's heart. So the people went through all these tribulations. The Egyptians and the Hebrews went through these tribulations. And the Pharaoh did unrighteous things, but it was to lead to a righteous path, which was the covenant, or the law, the Mosaic Law, which leads us to the covenant. And another thing too that they're saying is that they're trying to isolate themselves. They're saying that we're that special. That's something that we've also looked at. They're that special group. They're supposed to be the nation among the people representing God. And so right here, Paul is using their arguments, and as we'll see going forward, he's using their argument against them. He's saying, just because you're that special, just because you've been appointed to a spot, doesn't mean you're not equally as guilty as the person who was outside of that spot. So any thoughts real fast? Another thing that I want us to think about too in this section is that the Jewish people had something that was very significant that the Gentiles didn't have. And what is that?
They had the law. They had
the law,
They had
but-
the history.
They had the covenant.
No, something they could touch though. Something that they had the scrolls. So the Gentiles could have heard of it, but they really couldn't study it. So they didn't really know the full extent of what the laws were. I remember when we were in Acts, we talked about the Melodic Law. The Melodic Law is basically the law before the Mosaic Law. There's 7 of them. It was really simple. And it was still in effect if you weren't converted into the Judaism, but you were a Gentile wanting to worship. And so Gentiles, they didn't have the scrolls. They weren't even allowed to talk in the synagogues. I mean, we saw in Acts that they weren't even allowed in certain parts of the temple. The Jewish people had the scrolls, and that's like us today. Not everyone. You know, we think of a Bible so easily obtainable. You can go to a bookstore. The average Bible's like over $20 though. You can download it on your app. But how many times do people want to really download something like that? A lot of people don't actually have what we would call the modern day scrolls. And we have that. So we have that privilege. And so, we're kind of like in I would say we're like a parallel today of what the Jewish people were back then. We have this privilege in the sense of being an example.
People just take it for granted.
We take it for granted.
You don't realize how special it is when you're sitting inside of it.
And that's what Paul's argument that he's going to use that they always say against them. He's pointing out, as he pointed out in chapter 2, you're taking it for granted and you're forgetting the sight that you're supposed to be. But going through here, chapter 3 is mainly about justification in general. It's about being justified in what we do, justified in our actions, justified in when we preach. Because when we look back, no one was really justified before the covenant of Christ. Because in order for us to be justified, as we'll see going forward, we had to have that blood shed. There was no justification before. It was just doing it in the sense that you were told. But why? God told. But now we have justification because of what happened. Anything else before we move forward? Comments? Can someone get, and it's going to be kind of a little bit, 9 through 22? Or 9 through 20, I mean.
What then, are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave, they use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin.
So, Paul here, he does something that we see a lot of the authors do. He's quoting from the original scriptures, the Old Testament, and he's quoting specifically from around in Psalms 51, 53, certain passages within there. But I love what he says before he reads off the scripture. He says, "What then? Are we better than they? Not all. For we previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin." So, right here, he's making that connection. He's saying, yeah, you were the example, correct? You're supposed to be the example. But you're still succumb to sin. You are still fallible. And that's the one thing that's hard for some of us, even in today's world, to really comprehend is that we're fallible. And that's why one of the fruits of the Spirit is essentially like humility, to be humble, to be kind. Because when the pride takes over, we see with the Jewish people, it was hard for them when the new covenant came. And if you think about it, the Melodic Law was in effect from Noah to Moses, and that's thousands of generations, thousands of years. From this point, though, the Mosaic Law is only around for 100. It's a very short time. And that pride built up because of the Mosaic Law, because they were chosen. Christian, the New Covenant, similar. It's been around for the short time. But we need to always be aware that we are no different than a fallen sinner, because we are capable of falling. And that's why we have to have obedient faith. Like he says at the end, therefore by the deeds of the law no flesh will be justified. Just because you do good works, if you're not obedient in the faith and you don't hold to the faith. If you do these things, or you think, if I do something nice, some people think about that, if I do something nice today, that counts for me. That's what the Egyptians basically believed. They believed in a scale, and they went to the afterlife, and your deeds were weighed. When you had more good deeds, you would have a good afterlife. When you had bad deeds, essentially the same thing for the Greeks too. And so he's saying you're no different than those pagans and how they worship back then. That's how you're viewing it. Which is something for us today hard to get over. Moving forward though, he's reading Psalms. He's essentially saying, and he's asking the question, do the means justify the ends? He's asking that, why is that important? Do the means justify the ends? In this whole section, that's what he's asking. Because if the means justify the ends, then does the end really matter? Or does it matter how you get there? Is it the means itself, or is it the ends? So that's why he's bringing it up. It's a very hard question to ask. And he's saying the end goal is just as important as the way you get there. That's what he's saying. And that's what he's trying to bring up. Let's see, it was somewhere in here. His mouth is full of cursing, bitterness, destruction of the ways. Let's see, there was one line within the Psalms. This is none who is deep, who does not good. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. Verse 17. In the way of peace they have not known. So think about that. I want to stop at verse 17. The way of peace is not known. This is back in Psalms. But why is Paul referencing Psalms right here and saying that they have not known peace? Is it because of what happens in Lamentation in Babylon? It's because the Messiah hasn't come yet. How can you know peace when the justification for your actions hasn't taken place? Think about it. You have to be justified in order to do something. Sometimes you don't. You can be a blindless, reckless person. To have peace of mind at it, you have to be justified. And Paul is saying here that the ends was for us because for God through the shedding of the Messiah. People haven't known that yet because they've been under a law that he later says an imperfect man, or a perfect man in a perfect law, is still not justified. That's what he's trying to get across. Any thoughts?
This section, I wasn't here for the intro, but I'm assuming Romans is to primarily Gentiles.
It's for both. It's for...
Well, Rome, I would think, is more Gentiles and the first part's like all the wrong the Jews did. So if you're a Gentile reading this, you're like, yeah, finally, no chance. And it's like, no, you're just as wrong.
Yeah, it's on both sides.
Everybody. There's no, not one.
It's on both sides, and that's correct. It's Paul is calling out both sides. It's there were, I believe at the time when we were going over the introduction, there were some Jewish converts, Jewish people trying to tell the Gentiles in Rome that they had to convert fully to Judaism. But likewise, there was also some Roman Gentiles who were keeping their paganist ways. So it's a letter to both that we'll see through Rome. And that's why, again, like I said before, when we look at Acts, I believe it's starting Acts 20 or 21, that 2-year gap when I believe he's in Ephesus still. And he comes back to the Jerusalem congregation, that whole spat starts. Rome, letters to Rome is a good idea of why he got in trouble. It was because they called him out for the teachings of the Gentiles. So like you're saying, Gentiles were, this is a good insight that's going on during that period.
Brandon?
Mm-hmm.
Some of us old guys have been studying Revelation with Dan Jenkins.
Mm-hmm.
And something Dan Jenkins pointed out, a lot of us, and it's on YouTube, so anybody can get into these 18 lessons, but it's really, pardon the pun, it's really revealing. Because he points out that most of the persecutions against the church were from the Jews, not the Romans, in the book of Acts. The light bulb turned on when you mentioned Acts 21. Throughout the book of Acts, very little persecutions are instigated by the Romans. In fact, Paul goes to the Romans to protect himself from the Jews, using his Roman citizenship. And it's just, I guess, a lot of people think his thorn in the flesh was those Judaizing teachers that wanted to turn Gentile Christians into quasi-Jews. You've got to be circumcised. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. And I think part of what the book of Romans starts out is all of y'all should know better. The Gentiles should know better because you've got nature telling you what's right and wrong. And as you pointed out, long before the law of Moses, there was a law of God that Melchizedek and Noah followed, and Nebuchadnezzar repented in sackcloth long before. In the book of Job, not Nebuchadnezzar, but the city of Nineveh. I'm sorry, the city of Nineveh, not Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sorry, but the city of Nineveh in the book of Job. All those things predated the law of Moses, but they acknowledged God then. Abraham sacrificed through Melchizedek, so people could be in a right relationship with God regardless of their heritage, whether they're Jew or Gentile. I know what assume does to you, but assume Melchizedek was a Semite, he was not a Jew, but he worshiped God. In fact, Abraham saw him as a priest. So Paul says none of you have any, you're all without excuse. And that verse 23 there, in verse 3, we're about to get to, all of sin and fallen short of the glory of God. But as you acknowledge, most of the persecutions against the church came from the Jews, and Paul was enemy number one for the Jews because he was a turncoat. He was their golden boy. He was a disciple of Gamaliel, and here he is following this heresy, quote unquote.
It was mainly Jews, and it does talk about that. We also need to remember too, I think it was 13 or 15 in Acts, where Paul and was it Barabbas? Paul and Barabbas, I think? Barnabas. Again, I can't. That was the B name for the Old Testament. I'm just going to go Barabbas. I don't know why. But
New Testament.
It's been a fun morning. But they went, I forget what city it was. It was a Gentile city, and they thought that they were the Greek gods. And when they made hey, we're not Greek gods, by the way. We're just preaching, they also got chased out of the city. So it was mainly, from what we've got written from the Spirit, it was mainly the Jewish people. But we also need to take into consideration, Gentiles were doing this too. It was both halves. And I think what Paul's saying, and what we need to take into life for today, back in the day, it was mainly the Jewish people that were doing this. Because they had the scrolls, they had the laws. That's what Paul is saying. He's saying, you're acting like you're better because you have this knowledge. You're justifying yourself unrighteously. And so today, if you think about it, it's kind of a 180. It's more so the Gentiles have been doing this lately. And that's what Paul, this letter is kind of reflecting on us to do better than what we did in the past. Just because we have the scriptures doesn't mean that we should think ourselves higher. We can fall quickly. And we shouldn't act like we know everything. And if we see someone who has good potential, like he was talking about with the Gentiles, who didn't have the scrolls, we have an obligation to help and teach. So.
What's the passage? Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Don't get so confident the fact that you, quote, know the truth, that you fall.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main reasons why people not just leave our, the Church of Christ, but just leave the church in general. Is because of the things that Paul is warning and talking about on both sides. Right now, for the Jewish people, he is saying that.
Well, now we live in a society that says there is no such thing as sin. And they laugh at people that talk about sin. So our society is very similar to that of the Roman world.
That's something that we learned a lot in Acts. Is basically the only difference is the tools. We have computer tools. That's basically it. Everything else was.
Everything was there. We just have the technology that broadcasts it. But every sin we see today was widely practiced in the Roman Empire by those people.
Yeah. So. Trying to see it. Trying to make some quick notes real fast. Someone can get. Let's go through 21 through 26 real fast. I'll get it. But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and prophet, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference, for all I've sinned and fall short, for all I've sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ, whom God set forth as a propitiation, not say that word, by his blood through faith, demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So I kind of want us to, I think it's Hebrews 10. We mentioned it last week. Let me go to it real fast. It's Hebrews 10:2. It's David found it. I mixed up. Yeah, so we talked about it last week, but I want us to think about it again. Hebrews 10, verse 4 verses, for the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never with these same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year make those who approach perfect. For then would they not have ceased to be offered? For the worshippers once purified would have no more consciousness of sin. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. So I kind of want us to look, when we look at this, look at verse 3, because it's very important. It's saying, but in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. So this whole chapter so far, Paul has been comparing the Gentiles and the Jewish people, saying your sins are the same, in a sense. They're the same in God's eyes. You're no different because you commit the sin. No one can truly get out of that. The only exception was Christ. No one else. Joshua, he couldn't get out. Moses, Abraham. Abraham, who God looked at as righteous, is still not justified. A righteous man, Abraham, was still not justified. None of these figures. None of the prophets, Isaiah. And he's saying, when you look at Hebrews, he's basically pointing out it's because they're sacrificing, but the sin is there every year. It's not being washed away yet. That last line in this section that we read, God demonstrates it, by justifying it. He wipes away the sins after the covenant comes of those who were faithful under the Mosaic law, under the Melodic Law. justified in doing it because they walked the path that God gave them at that time. But he's also telling us right here in this part that it wasn't the simple animals that could wash that away. It had to come through an extraordinary force. And so that's why when we look back in verse 17, they know no peace, basically. It's because they're not fully, the covenant hasn't been, the real covenant, I would say, hasn't been fulfilled yet. The true covenant. The one that was talked about even from the beginning. Where a son of the woman is going to stomp on the head of the snake, serpent. That hasn't come through yet. But those who follow the way that he gives and has the faith, they'll be justified in when the covenant comes, it's going to wash away.
Raven, some would alternatively say that happened at the cross when the son of the woman trampled the head of the serpent. One thing, our chapters kind of throw us off sometimes. Paul didn't write letters with chapter markings. So Hebrews 11 goes right into Hebrews 12, which just is speaking what you were saying, that you talk about Abraham and all these verse 38 of Hebrews 11, 39, and these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect or apart, and that is perfect meaning complete, apart from us. Therefore we also, since we're surrounded by, so there's no chapter 12 there, it's a letter. And it just runs right into the argument that Jesus brought that justification to all those people that are they're witnesses. Somebody used it in a sermon, like we're running a race and these people are in the stands, they're watching us, they're cheering us on through the Christian life. They received their justification through the blood of Jesus Christ too. They lived by faith, and their faith was rewarded with eternal rest.
Yes.
But they weren't justified until Christ, went to the cross. So they're cheering us on, that crowd of witnesses. But you see all these people that died in faith without what you've got. These people died. They went, they were burned at the stake. They were devoured by beasts. Died in faith, but they didn't have Jesus, and you've got Jesus. And so what's your excuse?
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to explain with the Genesis reference. Like the stomping on the head, that was fulfilled through the crucifixion. So, but yeah, and it's a very powerful thing also to think about what you were saying, because they didn't have the covenant. One of the things I think about is Alex. He brought up some last week was the judges. Think about the judges back then. They didn't have the kingdom or anything. This was after Moses, before the kingdom was set up. Think about being called upon to do that for your people and to the tribes.
Gideon is a great example.
Gideon is a good example.
My favorite.
Deborah's a good one too, because we want to think of Deborah in that position, but God used her in that same. But you kind of hit the head on the nail right there. Anything else before we move forward?
I hate to derail your discussion, but there's actually a play by Patty Chayefsky entitled Gideon. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's really well done, and it kind of portrays, in my mind, what Gideon was like when God is talking to Gideon. We read the story. It's not Patty Chayefsky was Jewish. Of course, he's writing about a Jewish hero. So I saw it done live when I was in college, and just was one of the best live plays I've ever seen. But the way the guy Hank McDaniel later on became a head of drama at Freed Hardeman portrayed Gideon, I could see the real Gideon. You want me to do what? I'm just this poor guy here, and it's just if you ever get a chance to see it or read it, it's good side literature, I suppose. Sorry.
No, I didn't even know there was a play, but I'm not surprised there isn't. But let's go, we got 7 minutes left, let's finish off this chapter. Someone can get 27th at the end, wrap it up.
Where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? No, but by the law of faith. Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Seeing it is one God which shall justify the circumcision by faith and uncircumcision through faith, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid, yes, we establish the law.
So, the first question that he brings up, where is boasting then? It's excluded. He answers his own question, but it goes back to like towards the end of chapter 2, where we see that the Gentiles, and Paul kind of calls them out, but they always keep boasting about having the law, and that they were chosen. And he's saying right there, in that simple question, where is the boasting then? It's excluded. He's saying, by what law of works? And it gets right to what Romans is all about. It's about faith. The Jewish people, the Jewish converts are still the transition, in a sense, in Acts, but they're still looking at the works only. They're still looking at the physical laws, the dietary rules that they have to follow, the cleanliness laws that they have to follow, the days in which to observe for holidays. And Paul is saying that it's not the case anymore. He says it very eloquently when he asks, is God only for the Jewish people? Then it's kind of ironic when you think about that question, because he's asking, is God only for the Jewish people? He's living in a time, and through the Old Testament, we see that there's always a group of pagans, Gentiles, who point out to their God. My God can kick your God's butt any day, essentially. That's what they're saying. The Jewish people were the exception in the sense that they never really did that. They were always being persecuted, but they also said, our God is God over all. Your gods, your spirits, your Elohims, in a sense, is what they were saying. Your Elohims, they're underneath God. They're below. And so, right here, he's asking his Jewish brothers, if our God is so powerful, then why is he not also the God over the Gentiles? He's saying that, he's not saying to not do the works part, because as we said before, a lot of the denominational world looks at Romans, and they don't look at James, but they look at Romans only. And Martin Luther himself tried to use Romans to justify faith only, but no works. Once saved, always saved. That's not what Paul is saying here. He's saying that you have to include faith in what took place. He is saying that works alone are hollow, and he's trying to get that across. We'll see later on when he talks about faith, he's going to stress, the importance of obedient faith. And obedient faith is different than faith, because obedient faith implies that you have to do something. There is a work that has to be done. Obedient faith isn't just sitting there doing nothing. Obedient faith implies that you have a task. And our task, one of the tasks that we have, is to go, spread the word, bring people to the family. But to us today, when we think of boasting isn't always going hooray and celebrating. Boasting can also be, I would never do that. I would never fall for that. You're boasting about how you would not succumb to a sin. But in this chapter, we're basically seeing from Paul, he is emphasizing justification is through Christ, and it's because we all sin. Both have to the point. Everyone sins. And that's why we have to be justified through Christ. Anyone else have anything to add? We have 2 minutes left. Any comments? Brian, could you lead us? Well, you led us in opening prayer, didn't you? Nolan, can you lead us in closing prayer?
Sure. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all that you've done to us. Thank you for the lesson that Brandon brought to us. May it seek its way into our hearts and glorify your name. Please help all those that are sick or need you in their life at this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hi.
They turn on the AC and the thing on the I feel fine. I don't know you're doing.
Because I have a shirt, a jacket, I have layers on. Oh, it is hot. I hope everyone